Flying cars are real, not concept art, not CGI. Joby Aviation has logged over 1,000 test flights. The FAA already has a regulatory framework for them. Multiple companies have functioning prototypes. That part is happening. Here's what no one is putting in the press release. The mainstream critique of flying cars is that they're too expensive, too impractical, a billionaire toy with no future. That critique is wrong. Not because flying cars will succeed, but because it completely misidentifies why they'll fail. Flying cars won't stay marginal because of cost. They'll stay marginal because the math of mass adoption leads to a death toll that makes our current road carnage look like a rounding error. The physics is already settled, the failure modes are already documented, and the people building these things already know it. Here's what they're not saying out loud. Point 1. The 3D killing zone. Ground vehicles fail in a very specific, predictable way. Car engine dies, car decelerates, car stops or drifts. If the worst happens, a collision, a blowout, a driver going unconscious, the catastrophe radius is roughly the width of 2 lanes of traffic, 4 meters, 6 if you're unlucky. The physics of road vehicle failures are violent but bounded. The damage stays close to the road surface. That's not an accident. Roads are designed around that assumption. Flying cars fail differently, completely differently. The technical name for what every major company in this space is actually building, Joby, Archer, Lilium, Whisk, is an eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing. These aren't propeller planes with folding wings. They're multi-rotor aircraft, closer in principle to a drone than a Cessna. Dozens of rotors spinning at high RPM, coordinated by software, making thousands of micro-corrections per second. When that system works, it's genuinely elegant. When it fails, you do not coast to a stop. You drop. The kinetic energy of a 1,000 kilogram vehicle travelling at 150 miles per hour is approximately 2.1 megajoules. That's a unit of energy most people don't have intuitive feel for, so here's the translation. It's roughly equivalent to detonating 0.5 kilogram of TNT into whatever happens to be below you. And below you is not an empty field. Below you is a school, a hospital, a street full of people who have absolutely no connection to your vehicle, your battery, or your decision to fly over their neighbourhood. This is not a thought experiment. This is basic ballistics applied to a new transportation modality. Here's the historical proof, and it's been sitting in military archives since 1962. The US Army actually built flying jeeps. The Piasecki Z8 Air Jeep, a real aircraft on a real budget with real military justification, designed to replace ground jeeps for battlefield reconnaissance. It flew well. It was technically viable. The Army cancelled the program anyway, and the reason they gave was specific. When a conventional jeep breaks down, a soldier is stranded. When a flying jeep breaks down at 200 feet, a soldier, and potentially everyone in the landing radius, is killed. The Army ran the failure mode analysis and concluded the entire risk profile was untenable for routine operation. That was 1962. The Army made this call before personal computing existed, before lithium-ion batteries existed, before GPS existed. With far more primitive technology than today's eVTOLs, the conclusion was the same. The 3D failure mode is categorically more lethal than the 2D failure mode. Now apply that same logic at civilian scale. General aviation, small planes, private aircraft, the category flying cars would be regulated under, currently kills approximately 1,300 Americans per year. That number sounds modest, until you realise there are only around 200,000 registered general aviation aircraft in the United States. Scale that fatality rate to 300 million vehicles, the rough size of the current US automobile fleet, and you've crossed into public health catastrophe territory. You're not talking about a transportation problem with a safety annex. You're talking about a mortality event with no precedent in peacetime transportation history. The FAA knows this. Their own urban air mobility roadmap conspicuously avoids any large-scale mass adoption scenario. The projections cap early deployment at 3,000 to 7,000 aircraft through 2028, not because that's the commercial ceiling, but because that's the boundary of what air traffic management infrastructure can handle before the risk calculus becomes impossible to defend publicly. They're not building a highway. They're conducting a very careful, very small experiment and hoping the failures stay rare enough to manage. What happens when the experiment scales, though? Because that's always the pitch. Start small, scale up. The early automobiles were dangerous too. The automobile comparison's the one defenders reach for immediately. It sounds reasonable on the surface. It falls apart as soon as you examine where automotive deaths actually come from. Point 2. The 2D to 3D collision multiplication. The reason road fatalities, 1.35 million per year globally, are not dramatically higher is a geometric accident that most people have never thought about. Roads are two-dimensional. When a driver loses control, they swerve within a plane, left or right, forward or backward if you're reversing. Every safety system ever designed for roads, guardrails, lane markings, rumble strips, crumple zones, pedestrian barriers, is built around the assumption that chaos unfolds in a flat space. 2 dimensions. Add the vertical axis. This is not a modest upgrade. It is an exponential change in the underlying collision mathematics. On a road, 2 vehicles can only collide if they occupy the same lane position at the same moment. 2 primary variables. In 3-dimensional airspace, vehicles can approach each other from above, below, and from angles that have no equivalent on a flat surface. The number of potential conflict vectors between any 2 aircraft doesn't double compared to ground vehicles. It roughly cubes. Aviation engineers have a name for the altitude band where this is most lethal. They call it the low-altitude danger zone, everything below 1,000 feet above ground level. 65% of all aviation fatalities happen in this zone, not at cruise altitude, where commercial airliners spend most of their time, in the window close to the ground, where aircraft are slow loaded, operating near obstacles, and performing the most demanding phases of flight, takeoff and landing. Here's the critical detail. Flying cars don't cruise at 35,000 feet. Their entire operational envelope, from the moment they lift off your driveway to the moment they set down at your destination, exists permanently inside this death zone, every second of every flight. Commercial aviation is extraordinarily safe, and the reason is not superior technology. The reason is that commercial aircraft spend the low-altitude danger phase over airports. Dedicated, cleared, precisely instrumented strips of land with no civilians within the full radius, with control towers, with approach radar, with ground crews trained for emergencies. The danger is isolated, the central selling point of flying cars. No airport needed, land anywhere, take off from your rooftop, is, structurally, a proposal to conduct the most dangerous phase of aviation continuously over inhabited areas at mass scale. The feature they're selling is the elimination of the one safety measure that makes aviation survivable. Let's make this concrete with a single event. In 1977, 2 Boeing 747s collided on a fog-obscured runway at Tenerife. 583 people died. It is still the deadliest aviation accident in recorded history. The proximate cause was communication failures between aircraft in a compressed, low-visibility environment. Both aircraft were operated by experienced crews following standard procedures. The runway was a single controlled surface at an airport specifically designed for aircraft operations. Now strip out the runway, strip out the control tower, strip out the ILS, approach systems and the ground radar, and the emergency crews. Give that same scenario. Multiple aircraft, limited visibility, compressed space, to millions of everyday commuters operating after work in light rain over a city of 8 million people. The Tenerife disaster is not a worst-case cautionary tale for flying cars. It is a precise operational preview. The question that never gets asked in the investor presentations is this: at what adoption rate does an unavoidable mid-air collision first happen over a populated city? Because the answer to that question is not never. It is a specific number of vehicles per cubic kilometre of airspace, and that number is much smaller than the proponents want you to think about. And even if you solve the collision problem, which you can't, but suppose, you still haven't addressed what these vehicles are made of. Point 3. The battery sitting underneath you is not your friend. Every eVTOL currently in production or serious development runs on lithium-ion batteries. This is not a design choice anyone made enthusiastically. It's a constraint. Internal combustion is too heavy for vertical lift. Hydrogen fuel cells are not yet energy dense enough at scale. Lithium-ion is the only chemistry that currently gets you off the ground at useful payload weights. The problem is the ceiling imposed by physics. Current production lithium-ion battery packs achieve roughly 250 to 300 watt-hours per kilogram. practical urban air mobility, enough range and payload to make the vehicle genuinely useful as daily transportation, requires approximately 400 watt-hours per kilogram. That gap is not a solvable engineering problem on a commercial timeline. It is a chemistry boundary. The companies working on solid-state batteries have been promising 400 plus watt-hours per kilogram for 15 years. The product is not on shelves. What this means in practice, the Joby S4, arguably the most developed eVTOL in the world as of early 2026, has a certified range of 150 miles. Its total takeoff weight approaches 2,200 kilograms. A very significant fraction of that weight is battery. The vehicle is, in a meaningful engineering sense, a battery with rotors and a passenger compartment attached. Now consider what lithium-ion does under catastrophic stress. A ruptured gasoline tank leaks fuel. It's a passive hazard. It requires ignition. It requires an external heat source, and once the fuel is consumed or dispersed, the reaction ends. You can extinguish gasoline fires with the right suppression. Lithium-ion batteries in catastrophic mechanical failure undergo what engineers call thermal runaway. The damaged cells begin generating heat internally. That heat accelerates the electrochemical reaction in adjacent cells, which generates more heat, which destroys more cells. There is no ignition source to remove because the battery is its own ignition source. The reaction cannot be stopped from the outside. It can only be contained, or it can burn through everything it contacts until the fuel is exhausted. This is not hypothetical extrapolation. In 2013 and 2014, lithium battery failures grounded the entire global Boeing 787 fleet, not once but twice. The 787 has active fire suppression systems, redundant battery containment, and is operated by airline transport pilots with emergency training. It took the FAA months to certify safe modifications. Flying cars will have none of the suppression infrastructure of a 787. Their operators will be licensed under a lighter framework than airline pilots, and they will be carrying a large format lithium battery at 300 feet over a neighborhood. In 2021, a Tesla Model S experienced thermal runaway in a residential garage in Texas. The fire burned for 4 hours. Firefighters used 28,000 gallons of water to extinguish it. That was a stationary ground vehicle in a structure with access for emergency services. A vehicle in thermal runaway at low altitude above a residential area is a different problem in every dimension. The burn site is not predetermined. Emergency services don't know where it's going, and the impact radius of the crash itself precedes the fire. The eVTOL industry is well aware of this failure mode. Their proposed solution is modular battery architecture and automated emergency landing systems. Both are real and meaningful mitigations. Neither eliminates the problem. They reduce the probability. They cannot reduce the consequence to zero. And at scale, millions of flights per day, a small non-zero probability multiplied by millions of exposures produces a specific expected annual casualty figure. That figure has been calculated by safety researchers. It is not published prominently by the companies doing the calculating. There's one final layer to this. It's the part that takes the flying car dream and turns it into something else entirely. Point 4. The Freedom Machine requires a prison to operate. Here is the only way flying cars become sufficiently safe for mass urban deployment. Total. Aerial. Surveillance. Not partial. Not selective. Total. The FAA's existing unmanned traffic management framework, the UTM system, originally designed for commercial drones, requires every registered aircraft to broadcast its position, altitude, velocity vector, and intended flight path in continuous real time. It requires geofencing technology that prevents aircraft from entering restricted airspace. It requires automated conflict detection that flags two aircraft on converging paths and sends correction commands before a human could react. And that framework was designed for small, lightweight, slow drones. The extension of that architecture to passenger eVTOLs, heavier, faster, with human lives on board, requires a surveillance and data infrastructure that makes every traffic camera network ever installed look like a roadside mailbox. To safely manage flying cars at urban scale, you need low-altitude radar coverage over every populated area, continuous telemetry from every vehicle with no latency tolerance, automated enforcement systems capable of identifying, tracking, and remotely commanding non-compliant vehicles in real time. Ground truth mapping of every obstacle, every building, every construction crane, every communication tower, updated continuously because construction happens. Elon Musk actually described this requirement accurately in 2017 when he called flying cars the wrong solution and specified that they would need a very detailed and accurate 3D map of every obstacle in the entire city, updated constantly. He was exactly right about the technical requirement. He just didn't follow the implication to its conclusion. The infrastructure required to prevent flying cars from killing people at scale is indistinguishable from total low-altitude airspace domain awareness over every city on Earth. Governments have wanted that capability for decades. Defense agencies have wanted it since 9/11. Urban planners have wanted it for drone delivery logistics. Counter-terrorism offices have wanted it for threat detection. Flying cars are the civilian justification that finally makes it politically sellable. The Wright brothers flew because the air was empty. The ground below was a beach and there was nothing for 12 seconds to go wrong. Scale that first flight to a city of 8 million people. Add adverse weather. Add human error. Add the incentive to cut maintenance costs. Add the driver who is running late and dismisses the low battery warning. And the only way to hold the system together is a command and control architecture with no precedent in civilian transportation history. The people selling you flying cars as the ultimate expression of personal mobility are, knowingly or not, building the argument for the most comprehensive aerial surveillance regime ever deployed over civilian populations. The freedom is the marketing. The infrastructure is the product. Here is where all of this settles. Flying cars are not being suppressed by entrenched automotive interests or overly cautious bureaucrats. They are being quietly contained by the people who understand what the failure modes look like when millions of people operate them over inhabited areas in the real world. The engineering is genuinely impressive. The problem isn't engineering. The problem is that when you move individual transportation from a flat surface to a three-dimensional space above the places where people live, every mistake becomes exponentially more lethal. Every battery failure becomes a fire risk for the people below. And the only viable safety architecture requires a surveillance system that no democratic society has ever explicitly consented to build. We made peace with road deaths because they are diffuse, individual, spread across time and geography in a way that allows us to treat them as statistical noise rather than structural failure. 1.35 million people per year, and we've normalised it. Flying car failures won't be diffuse. They will be sudden, visible, and they will land on people who never made a transportation choice of any kind. That is a different social contract entirely, and it's the social contract that the companies building these vehicles have not yet had a public conversation about. The automobile took decades before society fully reckoned with the true cost of giving every human being a fast, heavy, dangerous machine and calling it freedom. The reckoning for air happened before mass adoption. Every aviation fatality report is public. Every accident investigation is published. The system is transparent because early aviation deaths were so visible, they forced transparency. The question no one has answered, the one that should be keeping urban planners up at night, is this. If the sky above every city eventually gets as congested as the roads below it, and the failure modes are an order of magnitude more lethal, what does that do to the value of simply living on the ground? Think about that the next time someone shows you a promo video with smooth jazz and a happy commuter landing in their driveway. Subscribe to the channel. More of this coming.